What happens when gravity becomes your enemy at 15,000 feet? Your parachute becomes a death trap, and the only thing standing between you and certain death is the training that lives in your bones. Most people would pray.
Most people would panic. Most people would die. But Sarah Chen wasn't most people. She was a Navy SEAL, one of only 12 women to ever earn the Trident.
And on a routine training jump over the Nevada desert, she was about to prove that when the impossible happens, SEALs don't just survive. They find a way to turn disaster into victory.
This is the story of a woman who fell from the sky without warning, landed in hell, and walked out alive. But survival was just the beginning.
What happened next would redefine what it means to never quit, never surrender, and never leave a teammate behind, even when that teammate is yourself. Some stories are born from courage,
Others from skill. This one was born from both, wrapped in a parachute that wouldn't open and sealed with blood on desert sand. This is Sarah's story, raw, real, and absolutely true. Sarah Chen adjusted her goggles one final time as the C-130 Hercules climbed through the Nevada sky. At 15,000 feet, the desert below looked like a brown carpet scattered with rocks and scrub brush. The morning sun painted the landscape in harsh shadows, and she could see the drop zone marked with orange smoke in the distance. This was supposed to be routine, just another training jump with her SEAL team. She had done this exact drill 47 times before, but today would be different. Today would test everything she had learned in the most brutal military training program in the world. The red light glowed above the aircraft door, signaling 5 minutes to jump. Sarah ran through her mental checklist. One more time. Main chute, check. Reserve chute, check. Altimeter reading properly, check. Radio functioning, check. She touched the small compass on her wrist, a gift from her father before she left for Bud/S training 3 years ago. He had been a Marine, killed in Afghanistan when she was 16. That compass had guided her through every challenge since. Her teammate Marcus Rodriguez gave her a thumbs up from across the aircraft. They had been through Hell Week together, survived the brutal selection process, and earned their Trident pins on the same day. Marcus was built like a linebacker, but moved like a dancer when he needed to. Today you would be jumping third in their 4-man stick. Sarah was jumping second, right after their team leader, Chief Petty Officer Williams. The aircraft shuddered slightly as it hit some turbulence. Sarah felt her stomach drop for just a moment, but she had learned to love that feeling. It meant they were getting close. She thought about the mission they were training for, a potential extraction operation in hostile territory. Every detail mattered. Every skill had to be perfect. Lives would depend on getting this right. Chief Williams stood up and moved toward the door. He was a 20-year veteran with more combat deployments than Sarah could count. His face showed the weathered look of a man who had seen too much but never backed down. He checked the wind readings one final time and nodded to the jump master. The green light would come on any second. Sarah's mind wandered briefly to her childhood home in San Francisco. Her mother had begged her not to join the military after losing her father, but Sarah knew she belonged here. She had always been different. Stronger, faster, more determined than other girls her age. She remembered climbing the Golden Gate Bridge towers on a dare when she was 14, hanging by her fingertips 200 feet above the bay while her friends screamed at her to come down. Fear was something she felt, but it never controlled her. The aircraft door slid open with a mechanical grinding sound. Wind rushed into the cabin, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly. Sarah could smell the thin air and feel the power of the engines vibrating through her boots. This was the moment she lived for. The edge between safety and the unknown. Chief Williams moved to the door and looked down at the desert floor far below. The drop zone looked tiny from this height, just a small clearing surrounded by rocks and Joshua trees. He held up one finger. 1 minute to go. Sarah stood up and checked her gear one final time. Everything felt solid and secure. The green light flashed on. Chief Williams stepped forward without hesitation. Sarah watched him disappear through the door in perfect form. Arms crossed, legs together, body straight as an arrow. She counted to 3 and moved to the door herself. The wind hit her like a physical wall, trying to push her back into the aircraft. But she had done this too many times to let that stop her. She looked down at the earth rushing away below her boots. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she noticed that the wind seemed stronger than the jump master had reported. The orange smoke markers on the ground were being blown in different directions, creating weird patterns that didn't match the weather briefing. But there was no time to think about that now. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped into space. The first few seconds of any jump were always the same. The aircraft disappeared above her as she fell away from it.
The wind stopped being an enemy and became something she could work with. Her body naturally found the stable position she had practiced thousands of times. Arms out, legs spread, face toward the earth.
The altimeter on her wrist started spinning as she picked up speed, but something was wrong. She could feel it in the way the air moved around her body. The wind wasn't coming from the direction it should have been. Instead of the steady northwestern breeze that had been forecasted, gusts were hitting her from multiple directions. She looked around for Chief Williams but couldn't see him anywhere in the clear blue sky. At 5,000 feet, Sarah reached for her ripcord.
This was the moment when training took over completely. Pull at 5,000, deploy by 4,000, be under canopy with enough time to navigate to the landing zone.
Her hand found the handle and she pulled hard. Nothing happened. She felt the ripcord come free in her hand, but there was no familiar jerk of the parachute deploying. No sudden deceleration. No canopy blossoming above her head. She was still in freefall, and the ground was getting bigger fast. Sarah forced herself to stay calm. This was exactly the kind of emergency they had trained for. She looked at her altimeter. 4,200 feet and falling. Time to go to the reserve chute. She reached across her chest for the reserve ripcord handle, found it, and pulled with everything she had. Again, nothing happened. Now the real fear started to set in. Sarah twisted her body to look up at her main parachute pack. What she saw made her blood run cold. The pack was partially open, but the parachute was tangled in its own lines, forming a twisted mess that looked like a giant knot. Worse, the reserve chute had deployed into the same tangle, making the whole situation 10 times more dangerous. She was trapped in what skydivers call a bag lock, when the parachute comes out of its deployment bag but can't inflate properly. Combined with the reserve chute deployment, she now had hundreds of feet of tangled lines and fabric whipping around above her head. Instead of saving her life, her parachutes had become a death trap. The altimeter read 3,500 feet. At her current rate of descent, she had maybe 90 seconds before impact. Sarah's SEAL training kicked in with crystal clarity. Rule number 1, never panic. Panic kills faster than bullets. Rule number 2, assess the situation completely before taking action. Rule number 3, there is always a solution, even when it seems impossible. She twisted her body again to get a better look at the tangle above her. The main chute was partially inflated but collapsed on one side. The reserve was completely fouled, wrapped around the main chute lines like a spider web. The risers, the straps connecting her harness to the parachute, were twisted and pulling in different directions. At 3,000 feet, she made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone watching from the ground. Instead of continuing to fall in a helpless tangle, Sarah began climbing up her own parachute lines. Hand over hand, she pulled herself up toward the tangled mess of fabric and cord above her head. The wind was tremendous at this speed, trying to rip her hands away from the lines. The nylon cords cut into her palms even through her gloves. But she kept climbing using the upper body strength that had carried her through SEAL training. At 2,500 feet, she reached the edge of the tangled canopy. Up close, she could see exactly what had gone wrong. A malfunction in the deployment bag had caused the main chute to come out sideways instead of straight. When she pulled the reserve, it had deployed directly into the fouled main chute, making everything worse. But she also saw something else, a possibility that most people would never have noticed. One section of the main canopy was still properly inflated. If she could untangle it from the reserve chute and cut away the damaged sections, she might be able to get enough lift to slow her descent. Sarah pulled the survival knife from her boot and began cutting. Each slice had to be perfect. Remove the tangled sections without destroying the parts that could still save her life. She worked with the focused intensity that had made her one of only 12 women to ever complete SEAL training. Nothing existed except the knife, the fabric, and the rapidly approaching ground. At 2,000 feet, she freed the good section of the main canopy. It immediately began to inflate properly, jerking her upward with enough force to nearly dislocate her shoulders. But it wasn't enough. She was still falling too fast, and she could see individual rocks and bushes on the desert floor below. She looked at her altimeter one more time. 1,500 feet. In 60 seconds, this would all be over one way or another. The partially inflated chute had slowed her descent, but she was still coming down at nearly 30 miles per hour. That was enough to kill her on impact with the hard desert ground. But Sarah Chen hadn't quit when the instructors told her women couldn't be SEALs. She hadn't quit during Hell Week, when hypothermia nearly killed her. She hadn't quit when a training accident left her with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. And she wasn't going to quit now. She grabbed the steering toggles of the partially working parachute and began the most important navigation of her life. If she could find soft sand instead of rocks, if she could time her landing just right, If she could use every technique she had learned about surviving high-impact falls, she might live through this. The ground rushed up toward her boots, and Sarah Chen prepared to prove that seals don't just survive the impossible, they find a way to turn it into a victory.
Sarah had 15 seconds to choose between a cluster of jagged rocks and a patch of sand that might be soft enough to survive. The partially inflated parachute gave her just enough control to make the choice, but not enough to guarantee survival either way.
She pulled hard on the left steering toggle, banking toward the sandy area while fighting against wind gusts that seemed determined to drive her into the rocks. 10 seconds. She could see her shadow racing across the desert floor below. The sand patch was smaller than it had looked from higher up, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by scattered boulders and thorny Joshua trees.
She would have one chance to hit it perfectly, or she would die on impact. 5 seconds.
Sarah pulled her knees up toward her chest and prepared for the hardest landing of her life. She remembered her parachute landing fall training. Feet together, knees slightly bent, ready to roll with the impact instead of fighting it. But all that training assumed a properly functioning parachute and a normal rate of descent. This was going to be like jumping off a 3-story building. 2 seconds. The ground filled her entire field of vision. Impact. Sarah hit the sand at 28 miles per hour with the force of a small car crash. Her feet touched first, but the speed was too great for any normal landing technique. She rolled hard to the right, bounced twice, and slammed into a boulder that stopped her forward momentum with a sickening crack. The partially inflated parachute collapsed around her like a burial shroud, blocking out the sun and trapping her in a tangle of nylon and rope. For several seconds, Sarah wasn't sure if she was alive or dead. Her entire body felt like it had been hit by a truck. Sharp pain shot through her left leg, and she could taste blood in her mouth. But she could feel her heart beating and air moving in and out of her lungs. That meant she was alive, which was more than she had expected 30 seconds ago. She lay still for a moment, trapped under the collapsed parachute, and tried to assess her injuries. Her left leg was definitely broken. She could feel the unnatural angle below her knee and the grinding sensation when she tried to move it. Her ribs ached with every breath, suggesting at least one was cracked. Her face felt like hamburger meat where it had scraped across the sand and rocks, but her spine felt intact, her arms worked properly, and most importantly, her mind was clear. She was hurt but not dying. That was enough to work with. Sarah used her survival knife to cut through the parachute fabric above her head. Sunlight streamed in through the hole, along with a blast of desert heat that reminded her she was in one of the most hostile environments in North America. The Nevada desert in August was no place to be lying injured and alone. She pushed the fabric aside and sat up slowly, fighting against waves of dizziness and nausea. The landscape around her looked like something from another planet, nothing but rocks, sand, and scrub brush stretching to the horizon in every direction. The drop zone where she was supposed to land was nowhere in sight. The freak wind currents that had caused her parachute malfunction had also blown her miles off course. Sarah reached for her radio to call for help, but found only broken pieces of plastic and metal attached to her harness. The radio had been destroyed in the impact. Her GPS unit was also smashed beyond repair. She was alone in the desert, with no way to communicate her location and injuries that made walking nearly impossible. But she was a Navy SEAL, trained to survive in situations that would kill most people. The first priority was medical attention for her broken leg. She pulled out her emergency first aid kit and found the morphine injector she hoped she would never have to use. The pain was getting worse by the minute, and she needed to be able to think clearly. The morphine took the edge off the agony in her leg, but also made her slightly drowsy. She fought against the drug's effects and focused on her immediate survival needs. Water was the most critical. In this heat, dehydration could kill her within hours. She had 1 quart in her survival kit, which might last until evening if she was careful. Next was shelter. The sun was already brutal, and it would only get worse as the day progressed. She looked around for anything that could provide shade and spotted a gap between 2 large boulders about 30 yards away. If she could reach it, the rocks would provide protection from both the sun and the wind. Moving with a broken leg would be excruciating, but Sarah had learned to work through pain during her military training. She fashioned a crude splint from parachute cord and pieces of her survival kit, binding her leg as straight as possible. Then she began the agonizing process of dragging herself across the desert sand. Each movement sent lightning bolts of pain up her leg, but she focused on her breathing and kept moving forward 1 foot at a time. The sand was already hot enough to burn exposed skin, and she could feel the heat building toward the murderous levels that made this desert famous. Rattlesnakes and scorpions lived here along with other creatures perfectly adapted to kill anything that didn't belong.
It took her nearly an hour to cover the 30 yards to the boulder shelter. By the time she reached the shade, her uniform was soaked with sweat and blood, and the morphine was wearing off, but she had accomplished her first goal, finding protection from the sun that would otherwise cook her alive. Sarah leaned back against the cool rock and tried to think clearly about her situation. She was injured and alone in hostile territory with limited supplies. No one knew exactly where she was, and the search and rescue team would have to cover hundreds of square miles of desert to find her. She might be here for days, but she had survived the impossible fall, and that gave her confidence that she could survive whatever came next. She had water for maybe 12 hours if she was careful. She had some emergency food that would last 2 or 3 days. She had medical supplies and the training to use them properly. Most importantly, she had the mental toughness that came from years of pushing her body and mind past normal human limits. As the afternoon heat built toward its peak, Sarah began planning her survival strategy. She would rest during the hottest part of the day and conserve water. When evening came, she would try to move to higher ground, where a rescue helicopter might spot her more easily. If no rescue came within 48 hours, she would have to attempt walking out of the desert on her own, broken leg or not. But first, she needed to deal with the immediate medical crisis developing in her left leg. The break was worse than she had initially thought. What she had assumed was a simple fracture was actually a compound break. The bone had punched through the skin, creating an open wound that was already showing signs of infection in the desert heat. Without proper medical treatment, the infection could kill her faster than dehydration or exposure. She had antibiotic pills in her survival kit, but they might not be enough for a wound this serious. She would have to clean and dress the injury with the limited supply she had, then hope her body's natural healing ability could fight off the worst of the infection. Sarah cut away the fabric around the wound and nearly passed out from what she saw. The bone had created a jagged hole in her calf, and desert sand was already working its way into the exposed tissue. She would have to clean it thoroughly, no matter how much it hurt. Using precious water from her survival kit, she irrigated the wound as best she could. The pain was beyond anything she had experienced even during the most brutal parts of her military training. But she forced herself to continue until the worst of the sand and debris was washed away. Then she applied antibiotic ointment and wrapped the leg as tightly as possible with the bandages from her first aid kit. The sun was reaching its peak intensity now, and even in the shade between the rocks, the temperature was climbing past 110 degrees. Sarah rationed herself to tiny sips of water every 30 minutes and tried to rest as much as possible. She thought about her team members who had jumped with her, Chief Williams, Marcus Rodriguez, and the others. They would have landed safely at the drop zone and immediately realized she was missing. The search would already be underway. But the desert was vast and unforgiving. From the air, one injured person lying between rocks would be nearly invisible among thousands of similar formations. She couldn't count on being found quickly. She would have to save herself. As the afternoon stretched on, Sarah began to hear things that weren't there. The combination of pain, medication, dehydration, and heat was playing tricks with her mind. She heard helicopter rotors. That turned out to be wind through the rocks. She heard voices calling her name that were actually just the sound of sand blowing across stone. But she also heard something real, the distinctive rattle of a snake somewhere nearby. Rattlesnakes were common in this part of Nevada, and they were most active during the heat of the day when they sought shade to cool down. The same rocks that were protecting her from the sun might also be home to creatures that could kill her with a single bite. Sarah forced herself to stay perfectly still and listen carefully. The rattling came again, closer this time. She slowly turned her head and saw a diamondback rattlesnake coiled in the shade just 10 feet away. It was watching her with the cold intelligence that made snakes such effective predators. One defensive strike from that snake would inject enough venom to kill her within hours. And there was no anti-venom in her survival kit. The snake seemed content to share the shade as long as she didn't move aggressively. But if she needed to change positions or access her supplies, it might interpret any motion as a threat. Sarah had fought terrorists and survived impossible falls, but now her life depended on a staring contest with a reptile that had millions of years of evolution on its side. The desert was testing every skill she had learned and every ounce of mental toughness she possessed. The fall from the sky had been just the beginning. Now the real survival challenge was starting, and it would push her past every limit she thought she knew. For 3 hours, Sarah and the rattlesnake maintained their deadly standoff in the shade between the boulders. Neither moved more than necessary. The snake remained coiled and ready to strike, while Sarah kept perfectly still except for the shallow breathing that was all her injured ribs would allow. The desert heat climbed past 115 degrees, making the air itself feel like a weapon. The snake was beautiful in its deadliness, 4 feet of muscle and instinct wrapped in diamond-patterned scales that seemed to shimmer in the filtered sunlight. Sarah found herself studying its alien intelligence, the way its tongue flicked out to taste the air for chemical signals she couldn't even imagine.
This creature was perfectly adapted to survive in conditions that would kill her within days. Right now, it had every advantage except one. She was smarter. As the afternoon peaked and began its slow decline toward evening, Sarah started to plan her move. The snake was blocking her access to half of her shelter, and most importantly, her water bottle. She could survive without food for weeks if necessary, but in this heat she needed water every few hours, or her body would begin shutting down. She remembered a lesson from survival school about dealing with venomous snakes. The instructor had been a grizzled Marine who claimed to have been bitten by everything that crawled, swam, or flew. His advice was simple: snakes want to conserve energy just like everything else in the desert. They won't strike unless they feel directly threatened or see something that looks like food. The key was to move slowly and deliberately, never making sudden motions that could be interpreted as aggressive. Sarah waited until a cloud passed over the sun, providing a few degrees of relief from the brutal heat. Then she began to inch sideways along the rock wall, moving so slowly that her progress was barely visible. Each movement had to be carefully controlled despite the pain in her leg and ribs. One quick motion or stumble could trigger a strike that would end everything. The snake's head tracked her movement like a radar dish following an aircraft. Its body remained coiled and ready, but it didn't rattle again or show other signs of immediate aggression. Sarah continued her glacial progress along the rock face, stopping frequently to let the snake adjust to her new position before moving again. After 45 minutes of careful movement, she reached her water bottle. The plastic was hot enough to burn her hands, but the liquid inside was still cool and precious. She allowed herself a slightly larger sip than before. The effort of moving had dehydrated her more than expected. Then she settled into a new position where she could monitor the snake while still maintaining access to her supplies. The sun was finally beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Sarah heard the sound she had been praying for, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. But this time it wasn't her imagination. The sound grew steadily louder, and she could see a dark speck against the sky moving in a search pattern across the desert. The search and rescue helicopter was still miles away and showed no signs of heading in her direction. From the air, her location between the rocks would be nearly invisible unless the crew knew exactly where to look. She needed to signal them somehow, but without flares or a mirror, her options were limited. Sarah looked around desperately for anything reflective that could catch the sun and create a signal visible from aircraft. Her broken radio had some shiny metal components, and there were pieces of her parachute that might work. But any attempt to gather signaling materials would require moving around the snake, and the helicopter would be out of range within minutes. She made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. Sarah grabbed a handful of sand and threw it directly at the rattlesnake, while simultaneously rolling away from her shelter toward open ground. The snake struck at the sand with lightning speed, its fangs injecting venom into harmless desert dirt. By the time it recovered and prepared to strike again, Sarah was already 15 feet away and crawling rapidly toward her collapsed parachute. Her broken legs screamed with agony as she dragged herself across the hot sand, leaving a trail of blood from her reopened wound. But she could still hear the helicopter in the distance, and this might be her only chance for rescue. She reached the white nylon of her parachute and began gathering the brightest sections into a makeshift signal panel. The helicopter was closer now, but still traveling away from her position. Sarah spread the parachute fabric across the dark rocks where it would create maximum contrast and began waving her arms above her head. The movement sent lightning bolts of pain through her damaged ribs, but she forced herself to continue. She was a tiny figure in an enormous landscape, and catching the attention of that helicopter crew was literally a matter of life and death. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the helicopter continued on its original course. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the crew hadn't seen her signal. The aircraft was already several miles away and heading toward the next sector of their search grid. She had used her only chance and failed. But then something miraculous happened. The helicopter banked sharply to the left and began flying directly toward her position. Someone in that aircraft had spotted her makeshift signal panel and recognized it as a distress marker. Within minutes, the sound of rotors was directly overhead, and she could see faces looking down at her from the helicopter's open door. The aircraft landed 50 yards away in a cloud of dust and rotor wash that covered everything in a fine layer of desert grit. Sarah had never seen anything more beautiful than the two paramedics who jumped out and ran toward her position carrying medical equipment and water. Behind them came Chief Williams, his face showing a mixture of relief and concern that she recognized from their most dangerous missions together.
The medical team went to work immediately, checking her vital signs and starting an IV to combat dehydration.
The paramedic examining her leg shook his head grimly when he saw the compound fracture and the signs of infection that were already developing around the wound. But he assured her that with proper treatment she would make a full recovery. The broken bones would heal and the infection could be stopped with antibiotics. As they prepared to transport her to the helicopter, Sarah insisted on looking back at her shelter between the rocks.
The rattlesnake was still there, coiled in the shade and watching the commotion with its unblinking reptilian gaze. She felt an odd sense of respect for the creature that had shared her ordeal without actually trying to kill her.
Both of them were survivors in their own way, perfectly adapted to handle whatever the desert threw at them. Chief Williams helped carry her stretcher to the helicopter, and as they lifted off, Sarah got her first aerial view of where she had been stranded. From the air, she could see that she had landed more than 8 miles from the designated drop zone, blown off course by the same freak winds that had caused her parachute malfunction. The search teams had been looking in completely the wrong area until her signal panel had redirected them. The flight to the hospital took 20 minutes, during which the medical team worked to stabilize her injuries and manage her pain. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, exhausted by the ordeal but deeply satisfied that she had survived something that should have killed her.
She thought about the moment when both parachutes had failed and she was falling towards certain death. Most people would have given up at that point, but her training had taught her to keep fighting until the very end.
As they approached the hospital landing pad, Sarah could see news crews and military officials waiting below. Word had already spread about the dramatic rescue of a female Navy SEAL who had survived an impossible fall.
But she wasn't thinking about the attention or the questions that would come later. She was thinking about the lessons this experience had taught her about the difference between being tough and being truly unbreakable. The helicopter settled onto the landing pad with a gentle bump, and medical personnel rushed forward to transfer her to the emergency room. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself relax for the first time in 8 hours. She had fallen from the sky without warning and landed in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. But she had faced injuries that could have killed her, dangerous wildlife, deadly heat, and the constant threat of dehydration or infection. But she had survived it all through a combination of training, intelligence, and sheer refusal to quit. That was what made her a Navy SEAL. Not just the ability to complete missions or operate weapons, but the mental toughness to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. She had proven that to herself in the most dramatic way possible. As the medical team wheeled her into the hospital, Sarah Chen smiled despite her injuries. She had fallen from the sky without warning, but she had landed on her feet in every way that mattered. The real test wasn't surviving the fall. It was what happened next. And she had passed that test with honors, written in blood and sand, under the unforgiving Nevada sun. The desert had tried its best to break her, but she was still here, still fighting, still proving that Navy SEALs don't just survive anything. They find a way to turn survival into victory. The emergency room at Desert Springs Medical Center had seen its share of military training accidents, but Sarah Chen's case was unlike anything the staff had encountered.
The combination of injuries from her high-speed impact, exposure to extreme heat, and the early stages of bone infection required immediate attention from multiple specialists.
Martinez, the orthopedic surgeon on duty, took one look at her x-rays and immediately began preparing for emergency surgery. The compound fracture in Sarah's left leg was more complex than anyone had realized during the helicopter rescue. The bone had shattered in 3 places, and fragments had damaged surrounding muscle and blood vessels.
Without immediate surgical intervention to clean the wound and stabilize the fracture, she risked permanent disability or even amputation. But Dr.
Martinez was a former military surgeon who had worked on combat injuries in Afghanistan. He understood that Navy SEALs healed differently than ordinary patients. They had pain tolerance and determination that often overcame medical limitations.
During the 6-hour surgery, medical teams worked to repair the damage while Sarah remained under general anesthesia. They removed bone fragments, cleaned infected tissue, and inserted titanium pins to hold her shattered leg together while it healed.
The procedure was complicated by the infection that had already begun to spread through her system, requiring massive doses of antibiotics to prevent sepsis. While surgeons worked to save Sarah's leg, Navy investigators were already analyzing the parachute malfunction that had nearly killed her.
The tangled parachutes and harness equipment had been recovered from the crash site and transported to a specialized laboratory where experts could examine every component for signs of failure or sabotage. What they found was disturbing enough to launch a full criminal investigation. Chief Williams sat in the hospital waiting room, still wearing his desert camouflage from the search and rescue operation. He had known Sarah since she first arrived at their unit 3 years ago, one of only 12 women to ever complete Navy SEAL training. She had proven herself in countless training exercises and 2 combat deployments.
earning the respect of every operator in their community. But this accident felt different from normal training mishaps. The weather conditions hadn't been severe enough to cause such a dramatic parachute failure, and Sarah was too experienced to make the kind of packing errors that could result in a double malfunction.
Marcus Rodriguez joined Chief Williams in the waiting room, along with the other members of their four-man team. They had all jumped from the same aircraft under identical conditions, but only Sarah had experienced equipment failure.
The coincidence was troubling, especially given some of the resistance she had faced from certain elements within the military who still believed women didn't belong in special operations units. Martinez emerged from surgery after midnight still wearing scrubs stained with Sarah's blood. The operation had been successful, but her recovery would be long and uncertain. The titanium pins would hold her bones together while they healed, but the damage to surrounding tissue meant she might never regain full mobility in that leg. For a Navy SEAL whose career depended on physical perfection, this injury could be career-ending.
But when Sarah woke up 18 hours later, her first question wasn't about her leg or her career. She wanted to know what had caused her parachutes to malfunction.
So, catastrophically?
As a professional military operator, she understood that equipment failures happened, but the specific sequence of events that had nearly killed her seemed almost impossible unless someone had deliberately sabotaged her gear. The investigation team arrived that afternoon, led by Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Agent Walsh had 20 years of experience investigating military accidents and crimes, and she had seen enough suspicious equipment failures to know when something didn't add up. The preliminary examination of Sarah's parachute gear had revealed several troubling anomalies that suggested deliberate tampering. The main parachute's deployment bag had been partially cut with a sharp blade, creating a weakness that would cause it to tear under the stress of deployment. The reserve parachute's ripcord had been rewired in a way that would prevent it from deploying properly when pulled. Both modifications were subtle enough to escape detection during normal pre-jump inspections, but they guaranteed catastrophic failure once Sarah left the aircraft. "This is the defects." Agent Walsh interviewed Sarah extensively about her recent activities and any conflicts she might have had with other personnel. The questions were uncomfortable but necessary. If someone had deliberately sabotaged her equipment, they were essentially attempting murder of a Navy SEAL, which carried severe criminal penalties including potential death sentences. Sarah thought carefully about the weeks leading up to the training jump. There had been some tension within the broader SEAL community about women in special operations roles. A few older operators had made comments questioning whether female SEALs could maintain the same standards as their male counterparts. But she couldn't imagine any professional military operator being willing to commit murder over gender politics. The investigation expanded to include everyone who had access to the parachute, storage, and packing areas.
This included not just the SEAL team members, but also the riggers who maintained the equipment, the jump master who had supervised the loading, and various support personnel who worked around the aircraft and gear storage facilities. Agent Walsh ordered background checks and polygraph examinations for more than 30 people.
Meanwhile, Sarah began the painful process of physical rehabilitation. The doctors had saved her leg, but rebuilding its strength and mobility would require months of intensive therapy. She worked with Marine Corps physical therapists who specialized in combat injury recovery, pushing herself through exercises that would have defeated ordinary patients. The pain was constant and exhausting, but she approached rehabilitation with the same determination that had carried her through SEAL training. Chief Williams visited her every day, bringing news from their unit and updates on the investigation. The rest of their team had been grounded pending the outcome of the criminal inquiry, which frustrated everyone involved. They were professional warriors who trained constantly to maintain their edge, and sitting idle while investigators worked through evidence felt like punishment for someone else's crime. 3 weeks into Sarah's recovery, Agent Walsh's investigation made a breakthrough. Polygraph examinations had revealed deceptive responses from Senior Chief Petty Officer Robert Kane, a 25-year veteran who worked in the parachute rigging facility. Kane had made several statements to other personnel questioning whether women belonged in combat roles, and his work schedule had given him access to Sarah's equipment the night before the fateful jump. When confronted with evidence of his deceptive responses, Kane initially denied any involvement in sabotaging Sarah's parachutes, but faced with the possibility of charges that could result in a death sentence, he eventually confessed to deliberately damaging her equipment. His motive was a twisted combination of gender bias and resentment over what he saw as lowered standards to accommodate female operators. Kane's confession sent shockwaves through the Navy SEAL community. The idea that one of their own would attempt to murder a teammate over gender issues violated every principle of military brotherhood and professional ethics. but it also explained the near impossible sequence of failures that had nearly killed Sarah. No amount of bad luck could have produced such a perfect storm of equipment malfunctions. Only deliberate sabotage could have created those conditions. Sarah felt a strange mixture of vindication and betrayal when she learned about Kane's confession. Her survival instincts and training had saved her from what was essentially an assassination attempt. But the knowledge that a fellow SEAL had tried to murder her was almost harder to accept than the physical injuries she had suffered.
The legal proceedings against Kane moved quickly through the military justice system. He was charged with attempted murder, destruction of military property, and conduct unbecoming of a non-commissioned officer.
The evidence was overwhelming, and his confession eliminated any possibility of claiming innocence. He would spend the rest of his life in a military prison, his career and reputation destroyed by his criminal actions. But for Sarah, Kane's conviction was just the beginning of a larger battle. Her physical recovery was progressing well. The titanium pins were holding properly, and her leg was regaining strength ahead of the medical team's most optimistic projections. But returning to full active duty would require passing the same physical fitness standards that had nearly killed candidates during her original SEAL training. The Navy offered her several alternatives to direct combat roles. She could become an instructor at the SEAL training facility, sharing her expertise with the next generation of operators. She could transfer to intelligence work, where her tactical knowledge would be valuable in planning and analysis roles. She could even accept a medical retirement with full benefits and pursue any civilian career she chose. But Sarah Chen hadn't survived an assassination attempt and months of painful recovery to settle for anything less than complete vindication. She wanted to return to her team, prove that her injuries hadn't diminished her capabilities, and continue serving as a Navy SEAL. The attack on her had been motivated by doubts about her fitness for the role, and the only way to definitively answer those doubts was to pass every test again. Dr. Martinez warned her that attempting to return to full duty carried serious risks. The titanium pins in her leg were strong, but they weren't indestructible. A hard landing during parachute training or a violent impact during combat operations could cause catastrophic failure of the surgical repair. She could end up permanently disabled or worse. But Sarah had made her decision. She would return to training as soon as the doctors cleared her for physical activity, and she would prove that neither sabotage nor injury could break the determination that had carried her through every challenge in her military career. She had fallen from the sky without warning and survived an attempted murder disguised as equipment failure. Now she would show everyone that Navy SEALs don't just survive anything, they come back stronger than before. The desert had tested her survival skills, the hospital had tested her healing ability, and the investigation had tested her faith in her fellow SEALs. But the real test was still coming. The challenge of proving that she belonged among the most elite warriors in the world, titanium pins and all. 8 months after her near-fatal fall, Sarah Chen stood at the open door of another C-130 aircraft 15,000 feet above the same Nevada desert that had almost killed her. This time, however, everything was different. Her left leg contained titanium pins that would set off metal detectors for the rest of her life. Her parachute had been inspected by 3 different riggers and checked personally by Chief Williams, and most importantly, Senior Chief Kane was serving a life sentence in military prison for attempting to murder her. The medical board had cleared Sarah for return to full duty just 2 weeks earlier, despite the concerns of several doctors who thought she was pushing her recovery too hard and too fast. The titanium pins in her leg had healed perfectly, and her physical fitness scores were actually higher than before the accident. But scores on paper were different from real-world performance under stress, and this jump would be the ultimate test of whether she could still function as a Navy SEAL. Agent Walsh had closed her investigation with Kane's conviction, but the broader questions about women in special operations remained. Sarah's survival and recovery had made her something of a celebrity within military circles, with some people hailing her as proof that female SEALs could handle anything the job required. Others argued that the fact someone had tried to kill her over gender issues showed how divisive her presence remained within the community. But Sarah wasn't jumping today to prove a political point. She was here because this was her job, her calling, and the thing she had trained her entire adult life to do. The desert below looked exactly the same as it had 8 months ago. Endless brown sand dotted with rocks and scrub brush. But she was different now, tempered by an experience that would have broken most people, and made stronger by the knowledge that she had survived the worst anyone could throw at her. Chief Williams gave her a thumbs up from across the aircraft, the same gesture he had made during her final jump before the accident. Marcus Rodriguez was jumping right behind her, ready to provide backup if anything went wrong. The entire team had volunteered to participate in her return to jumping status,
a show of support that meant more to Sarah than any medal or commendation ever could. The jumpmaster called out the 5-minute warning, and Sarah began her final equipment checks.
Everything felt familiar and comfortable: the weight of the parachute pack, the tightness of her harness, the controlled adrenaline that came before every jump. But there was also something new. A deeper appreciation for the fact that she was alive to experience these sensations at all. She thought about Kane, sitting in his prison cell and probably wondering if his attempt to eliminate her had accomplished anything. In a twisted way, his attack had made her stronger and more determined than ever. She had always been tough, but surviving an assassination attempt disguised as equipment failure had given her a level of confidence that couldn't be taught or trained. She had literally fallen from the sky and lived to tell about it. 7 footnotes said. The red light came on, signaling 1 minute to jump. Sarah moved toward the door with the fluid grace that marked a professional paratrooper. Her left leg felt slightly different because of the titanium pins, but it was strong and stable. The months of rehabilitation had rebuilt not just her injured bones and muscles, but also her confidence in her own body's ability to handle extreme stress. The aircraft door opened, and familiar wind rushed into the cabin. Sarah looked down at the desert floor and felt a moment of déjà vu so strong it made her dizzy. 8 months ago, she had looked down at similar terrain while falling helplessly toward what seemed like certain death. Today, she was looking down with complete control over her equipment and her destiny. The green light flashed on and Chief Williams stepped out without hesitation. Sarah counted to 3 and followed him into space, launching herself from the aircraft with perfect form. For the first few seconds, she experienced the same sensation she had felt during thousands of previous jumps, the aircraft disappearing above her, the wind becoming a tool instead of an enemy, her body finding its natural, stable position in free fall.
But this time was different because she was different. Every sensation was more intense, every moment more precious because she understood how easily it all could have been lost. She fell through the clear Nevada sky with the joy of someone who had been given a second chance at the thing they loved most. At 5,000 feet, Sarah reached for her ripcord without any of the hesitation or anxiety that had plagued her during training jumps in the weeks leading up to this moment. Her hand found the handle, and she pulled firmly. The parachute deployed perfectly, jerking her upward with the familiar sensation that meant everything was working exactly as designed. She looked up at her canopy and saw nothing but perfectly inflated nylon cells arranged in the rectangular pattern of a modern military parachute. No tangles, no malfunctions, no signs of sabotage. Just a piece of equipment doing exactly what it was designed to do, keeping her alive and giving her the control to navigate safely to the landing zone. The descent took 12 minutes, during which Sarah had time to think about everything that had brought her to this moment. She had survived an attack that was meant to end her career and possibly her life. She had endured months of painful recovery and rehabilitation. She had fought through doubts about whether she would ever be able to perform at the level required of a Navy SEAL. But more than that, she had proven something important about the nature of toughness and resilience. It wasn't enough to be strong or brave or skilled. True survival required the ability to adapt to circumstances beyond your control, to find solutions when normal procedures failed, and to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. Those were the qualities that defined a Navy SEAL, regardless of gender or background. At 1,000 feet, Sarah began her approach to the landing zone. The same orange smoke markers that had been blown around during her accident were clearly visible and steady in the light wind. She had perfect control over her parachute and could see Chief Williams and Marcus already on the ground, watching her descent with the attention of teammates who understood exactly what this jump meant. She executed a textbook parachute landing fall, touching down exactly in the center of the designated target area. Her left leg absorbed the impact without any problems, the titanium pins holding perfectly under the stress of landing. She rolled once to absorb forward momentum and came to her feet in one smooth motion, exactly as she had been trained to do. Chief Williams was the first to reach her, followed quickly by Marcus and the rest of their team. Nobody said much. There was no need for speeches or celebrations. Sarah was back where she belonged, doing the job she had trained her entire career to perform. The accident and recovery were behind her now, just part of her experience as a professional warrior. But as she gathered her parachute and prepared to board the helicopter for the flight back to base, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had fallen from the sky without warning 8 months ago and proved that Navy SEALs could survive anything. Today, she had returned to the sky by choice and proved that they could also overcome anything. The desert that had nearly killed her now stretched out below the helicopter as they flew back to base. It looked smaller somehow, less threatening than it had during those brutal hours when she was injured and alone among the rocks.
She had faced that environment at its worst and emerged victorious through a combination of training, intelligence, and sheer refusal to quit. Senior Chief Kane had tried to destroy her career and her life because he believed women couldn't meet the standards required of Navy SEALs.
Instead, he had given her the opportunity to demonstrate levels of toughness and resilience that went far beyond normal military training. She had not only survived his attack, but used it as motivation to become a better operator than she had ever been before.
As they approached the base, Sarah could see news crews gathered near the landing pad. Word of her return to jumping status had spread throughout the military community and beyond.
She would face questions about her recovery, her experience in the desert, and what her survival meant for the future of women in special operations. But those were conversations for later.
Right now, Sarah Chen was simply a Navy SEAL returning from a successful training mission. She had fallen from the sky without warning, survived an attempted murder, endured months of painful recovery, and fought her way back to full operational status.
She had proven that when the impossible happens, SEALs don't just survive. They find a way to turn disaster into triumph. The helicopter touched down gently, and Sarah stepped onto the tarmac with her parachute pack over her shoulder. She was home, back where she belonged, ready for whatever mission came next. She had been tested in ways that few people could imagine, and had emerged stronger than ever. The sky that had once been her enemy was now her ally again. And Sarah Chen was exactly where she was meant to be, among the most elite warriors in the world, proving every day that Navy SEALs survive anything and overcome everything no matter what tries to break them. Dropped from the sky without warning, she proved why Navy SEALs survive anything.